Good evening, Assalamu alaikum, and peace be upon you. Today I'd like to discuss an important topic, which is trying to answer the question whether or not religion is the most frequent cause of violence and conflict. Is religion the number one cause of violence, wars, and conflicts in human history? This is a claim that is frequently made by many people, and there have been many books published on this matter trying to prove it. Many people make such claims on mass media, and many people on YouTube make such claims as well. Recently, actually, I watched a video of a person making such a claim, and to provide proof for his claim, he said, I will open today's newspaper and just show you how many the acts of violence were caused by religion or motivated by religion. So he did open the newspaper and he found like 3 incidents which could be labeled as religiously motivated acts of violence, and he said, here is the proof. Religion is the number one cause of violence, conflict, war in human history. Now, this is a very naive way of thinking. As you can see, facts are not driven from reading a newspaper and a single newspaper. You can't analyze one newspaper. This is what is called in research selection bias. Your opinion is biased and skewed because you've only selected one newspaper. And as we all know, the media itself is already directed in a certain way so as to give a negative image about religion in general and Islam in particular, as you know. So there are many researchers out there who have conducted rigorous, in-depth, detailed research where they've analyzed all the conflicts that have occurred during the documented history of humanity, and they have come up with conclusions. An example of these good researches is a book by the name of Encyclopedia of Wars. This book has analyzed 1,763 recorded conflicts in human history, and the conclusion the authors have come to is that out of the 1,763 conflicts and wars, only 123 conflicts out of this huge number were religiously motivated. That's about a 6% figure of, or percentage of how many of those conflicts were religiously motivated. This alone shows you that such a claim has no basis. And if you look at the number of casualties or the death toll of all these 1,763 conflicts, what is the percentage of death toll that can be attributed to religiously motivated violence? You will be surprised to know that only 2% of the death toll of all the conflicts in human history can be attributed to religion. I have included this data and many other pieces of information and data and research in a PowerPoint presentation that you will find in the link below this video. I cannot go over everything, but I'm just mentioning some facts to you. And even many of those conflicts that we think are religiously based or religion based, researchers have found that many of them are not actually based in religion. There could be some other political or national or social or even economic causes behind them, but it so happened that the opposing parties had different religions. But the actual point of contention was not religion. And researchers have mentioned several examples of this, such as the French wars of religion, the Sri Lankan Civil War, even 9/11 and other terrorist attacks, those are based and caused by political conflicts initially, pertaining to intervention of certain powers in the Middle East, the occupation of Palestine, and so on. Yes, religion does play some role in these conflicts, but it is not the only player. If you look at history again, and you look at the non-religious dictators that have caused so much chaos, mayhem, damage, death, corruption, you will find that most of those dictators are actually non-religious, who have caused atrocities, massacres, and genocide. I will mention just a few examples for you. Joseph Stalin, for instance, and he was a communist atheist. He alone is probably responsible for the death of more than 42 million people. Somebody like Adolf Hitler, he's responsible for the death of more than 21 million people. Others like Mao Zedong, who was also a communist atheist, responsible for the death of more than 37 million people, and so on. Vladimir Lenin, an atheist communist, responsible for more than 4 million deaths, and so on. If we go and analyze even the recent history from 1945 till today, and you look at all the invasions that have occurred on the political and world scene, there have been 74 different invasions during this time period. And basically, you can look at each one of them, and the conclusion that researchers have found that only one invasion out of all these invasions was religiously motivated. Actually, researchers such as Rommel have found that dictators, governments, and states are the ones who are responsible for the biggest death tolls in human history, more than any religious wars have caused. Actually, Rommel feels that probably more than 360 million people have been killed in the documented human history at the hands of government, states, and dictators. This is a big number, because the estimated number of human beings who have been killed in conflicts in all the documented human history is estimated to be about 750 million. So about half of this number is caused by states, dictatorships, and governments. If you look at the conflicts that have had the biggest death toll in human history, I will just mention 5 of them in order of destruction and death toll. Number 1 out of these conflicts is World War II. By far, it is the most destructive conflict human history or humanity has witnessed. Between 1939 and 1945, between 60 to 118 human beings were killed in that war. It only lasted 6 years, but imagine the enormous death toll. And these are the people who were killed. You can imagine how many people were injured in this war. Usually the injuries and the casualties are much, much higher than the actual deaths in any war. The Three Kingdom War in China between 184 and 280 lasted 96 years. Death toll of 40 million. The Mongol conquests between 1206, between 1206, between the year 1206, which is 1206, and the year of 1368, lasted 163 years, resulted in more than 40 million deaths as well. The European colonization of the Americas, where the original inhabitants of the Americas were being displaced and replaced by European settlers, death toll from these conflicts that arose from this population displacement, anywhere between 8 million, that is the least figure given by historians, up to 138 million deaths over a period of 199 years. Similar things have happened during the Spanish colonization of the Americas, especially the Latin Americas. Between 15 and 70 million deaths over a period of 50 years. Actually, if you look at not only the biggest 5 conflicts like I mentioned here, if you look at the number one, the 100 conflicts that had the most death toll, or the biggest death toll in human history, out of those 100 conflicts in order of death toll, the conflicts that had religious motivations behind them are only 10 out of those 100. That's 10%. If you even look at today's world map, which country has the most deployments worldwide? By far it is the US. They have deployments in more than 177 countries. An estimated $100 billion required yearly to maintain these overseas deployments. If you look at the most recent invasions, it is mostly carried by either the US government itself, or as a military, or by the CIA. And the attacks worldwide, if you look at today, they are mostly carried by the USA in recent history. There is a very nice map I've included in the PowerPoint talk below this presentation. This map basically highlights all conflicts in the documented human history on the world map. It is very interesting to look at this map actually. This map was formed by a web platform that specializes in data analysis and visualization. They've placed on this map 2,657 battles that occurred in human history. And I want you to go and look at this map. You will see that most of the wars that occurred in human history, in a documented human history, you'll be surprised to know that most of these wars have occurred either in Europe or in the Americas. The conflicts and wars and battles that occurred in the Americas happened mostly during the displacement of the original inhabitants of these continents by the settlers, whether European settlers or the Spanish settlers in the south. While the wars in Europe, the map shows that those wars have occurred in different spurts throughout history. But if you look at numbers, most of the wars in human history have occurred in Europe or in the Americas. Much less number of wars have occurred in Africa, for instance, and Asia or the Middle East compared to these areas, Europe and the Americas. But the difference is that most of the recent wars have occurred either in Africa or the Middle East. And that is why it is the common perception nowadays that the Middle East is the only troubled area in this world. And I will explain more why the Middle East has more conflicts in another talk nowadays. And I'll just mention briefly the answer to that. The answer is not that this violence is caused by the presence of Islam in the Middle East, but it is primarily caused, and probably only caused, by the various dictatorships that rule the Middle East. Those dictatorships and those puppet governments that were placed by world powers in that position, they were not chosen by the people. They are imposing on the people the will, their own will, or the will of foreign intervening governments, not the will of the actual people who live on that land. And that is why there's always conflict between the people and these governments. People are always trying to overthrow these governments, and there's always revolutions and protests, and those governments do not regard human rights, and that is why the violence is escalating and so on. Yes, religion does play a part in some of the violence in the Middle East, but those dictatorships that have been placed and those puppet governments are the main cause. I think I would conclude this talk for today, and the next part of this talk will be pertaining to psychological studies and social studies and political studies that show us whether or not religion is the main cause of violence or could be a cause of violence. Thank you very much for watching.